Hey, good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Just raise your hand and say yes if you can. Guess it's just Zan. Okay. Was it a new agent or?
An investor who said he called Richard finds about property and they seem to be told Richard is an investor. Richard found out. He had an offer to make. For that. So he thought it was coming back. And get info on the property.
Yeah, I think I talked to Richard about that last week. He said the guy was driving him crazy. Probably. It was another road all off of it. So I just responded, more interested to get people in.
You can always take the offer. It's not, I think it's invested out of it. No, then that's the end of it. The seller gets signed as, on both sides of the lease, and he says he is representing the tenant as a customer. So I'm going off of the written document.
Okay, I'm just telling you what he said. Yeah, bring it here. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Barbara, good morning.
Good morning, Renee.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for doing it.
Sure. Hey, Sheena, good morning.
Good morning, guys.
We'll get started here in a few minutes. Got about 5 more minutes.
No worries.
Why do realtors get so many emails? It's ridiculous. Hey, Joyce, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
I'm
Hi, Renee.
Hey there, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Got about one more minute and then we'll get going. So
Okay.
thank you everybody that's on for attending. I greatly appreciate it. And a quick question, can everybody see the screen? Unilateral notice to terminate?
Yes.
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 Thank you. Okay, I've got 11 a.m. and I want to be mindful of your time. Again, greatly appreciated that you attended today. And to kind of recap everything that we've done over the last several weeks, basically what I tried to do was to take you from an agency agreement through the contract, additional forms that may or may not be needed, and finally to the terminations. It's not something that we like to do, but it is part of what we need to understand. And there are two types of termination that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a contract termination, and we're going to talk about agency termination. So to kick things off, this is the one that the majority of everyone sees or uses, and it's the unilateral notice to terminate, purchase and sale agreement, and proposed disbursement of earnest money. One thing I would like to remind you is that this is a two-part form. One, up here, unilateral notice to terminate, and then the second part, proposed disbursement of earnest money. So let's start up here. When you send on behalf of your buyer or sometimes seller, depending on the circumstance, we'll talk about that in a moment. When you send a unilateral notice to terminate to the other party, it automatically means that the contract is canceled. Okay? If you're a listing agent and you receive this from your buyer, then you can immediately, once this is signed by both the buyer and the seller on this top portion, well, actually, the seller doesn't even have to sign it because it's unilateral. But once they submit that to you, then you can immediately put your listing back on the market because you're out of contract. Okay? Second, the reason why you don't see this a lot of time with the seller submitting it is because in the contract, the seller is very, very limited to their ability to cancel the agreement without penalty. Penalty would obviously be the return of the earnest money if the buyer accepts it, and or payment of commission to the co-oping agent or the co-oping broker. So those are the penalties. For a buyer, it's much more fluid. Again, if you're within any of your contingencies and it's a valid termination, a buyer can cancel without penalty, which means they retain the right to keep their earnest money, and the buyer does not owe the seller a commission. It's not a penalty default. So that is probably the most important thing. Now, you have a couple of choices here: buyer's right to terminate during due diligence, failure of the following contingency to which the agreement is subject, which could be anything from seller repairs to who knows, it could be anything. Following default under the agreement by buyer or seller, and then finally, other lawful reason. And within the agreement, there are several instances where the buyer can terminate, again, without penalty, very few for the seller. I highlighted the seller because I just wanted to reiterate that. If your seller is trying to talk to you about getting out of the agreement just because they've decided not to sell the house, you have to explain what the penalty would be if they choose to do so. So again, it's kind of a tough one. The second part of the form, which honestly has no bearing on this top part of the form, because once it's unilateral notice is sent, it's canceled. On the second part of the form, both the buyer and the seller have to sign and agree to the proposed disbursement of the earnest money. Now, again, it's not a great situation to be in a transaction because you've put in a lot of hard work and effort. It's been stressful. It could possibly have been a long journey. But at some point, it's going to happen to everyone. You're going to have a canceled agreement. Now, with regard to disbursement of the earnest money, buyer can get their earnest money back with this unilateral notice to terminate if they are within their finance or their due diligence contingency. They also have a right to cancel without penalty if the appraisal comes back, and let's say the appraisal is low and the seller doesn't want to reduce it, then the buyer would have a right to cancel without penalty, as well as the seller in that situation. Because if the property doesn't appraise for purchase price or at least the minimum, the mortgage amount, then the seller has a right to terminate. They don't have to sell it. In fact, what I've been told, and this may or may not be true, is the seller, unless they receive a full price offer with no contingencies, does not have to sell that property. So if you ever get an offer that's clean like that, then the seller's all in and there's not a lot that they can do about it. If they decide for whatever reason they don't want to sell the property. Any questions on this or any comments or any experiences, good or bad, that anyone would like to share with the group this morning?
Yeah, then Renee, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Usually when the default of the buyer, he is losing his earnest money. That is obviously clear. But what about if the seller default or say, I don't sell this property? After we do inspection and do appraisals and everything, how do we request? It's your default. You have to be paid for the default to the buyer because he already spends certain amount of money. How do we get that? That is my always issue.
Right. And that's in the agreement. It clearly states in the agreement under default of seller or default of buyer that the non-defaulting party can recoup their expenses, such as the inspection or the appraisal or even the loan application. Any money that they can produce receipts for, they can turn them over to the seller. The hard part is trying to get a response or a seller to even, recognize that they do owe you that money for some reason or another. And this can go either way, buyer or seller. They just disappear and feel that they have no other obligation. So, in a situation like that, what do? You can try to run down the listing agent or the buyer's agent, whichever side that you're defaulted against, and, bring to light the obligations of their client to the contract. You can have an attorney send a demand notice or demand letter for the expenses as per the agreement. But much further than that, taking them to court civilly may or may not be an action that I would encourage. It's going to cost you about $500 to file it. So unless you have a substantial amount from 0 to 5,000, I can't necessarily say spend the money and take them to court. I was thinking about this morning, and one thing that I want to do is I think that I want to get on the GAR forms committee, the folks in the committee that create these forms, and, have them add what the penalty would be. Let's just say if the seller or the buyer doesn't agree to cover the other's expenses upon default. I think that there needs to be additional languages in this agreement to best serve the party that was defaulted against, because there's nothing in there.
Yeah.
And I'm sure every broker in Atlanta gets those questions every day. They're not responding. They're ghosting me. I can't, it cost my buyer $600 and, the seller can deliver title or whatever the reason is. I think that there should be some type of,
Obligation.
well, you can't really even, you could make it an obligation. I mean, they kind of do that already, but what resources you would have to pursue the buyer or seller if they didn't live up or to their side of the contract. So, like I said, I don't want to tell everybody, take them to court, sue them, whatever. It's too much of a litigious society as it is. So I certainly don't want to recommend that. But I do feel that if you're defaulted against, that you should have some type of compensation above and beyond just the earnest money, because, a buyer has a lot of expense in purchasing the property. So
This has happened, Renee, on one of my transactions a few years ago. After we process and when they check the title, there is a problem on their title. And my buyer is already spent inspection and appraisal. Yeah. And the request, at least you have to cover this default, these expenses. They say, no, my buyer is losing the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, this not happen every time, but, once in a while, if this happens, there is something that has to be,
And I agree with that. And I kind of hold part of that fault with the agent. I mean, the agents there, and I'm talking about co-oping agents, not talking about any of our agents, but the agent's right there, they're in there, they're through the whole thing. They're right there up front because they're going to get paid on it. But if it goes south and the agent really doesn't know what to do, then the agent disappears. It's just crazy. And that's why I think that these forms need to be amended to include, what steps the defaulted party could take to recoup their expenses. Not just the fact that they can get it, because that could be more money out of a buyer's pocket to try to recoup that from the seller. And that's the last thing a buyer wants to do. So,
It seems like the only ones that ever figured it out were the attorneys. You'd never see that happen to an attorney. They always get the retainer up front before they even make the phone call after their consultation.
It's agree.
Just we as agents have just said, we as agents just say, oh, we'll do it all. We'll spend our money. We'll go everywhere. We'll do everything. And then when we get, it doesn't go our way, we're at a loss. Yeah. And really, it should be a retainer up front.
Yes.
If you're hiring a service, really, it's our industry. Our industry really needs to change to be like doctors, lawyers, and every other profession.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes,
I agree with that, Alan. You make an excellent point. And there is, I don't know what the number is. I don't have my GAR form sheet in here, but there is a retainer form in the GAR forms. But I've rarely, maybe once or twice in the last few years, ever seen one that came through.
Well, unless you're doing unless you're doing it for your parents, somebody's going to just walk away from
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, agree. I do agree with that. So yeah, again, I think that there needs to be some more direction for, those brokers and those agents out there that, what do I do type thing. So,
Well,
but
I think in our business over the last few years, where you're getting multiple contracts and you're getting backup contracts, a lot of times that backup contract will be better than the one that's on the table.
yes,
And it prompts the seller to want to, cancel the one that's on the table and take the other one.
Yeah.
I've had that a few times, and it took a lot of questions on the part of one guy. He was just going to go out there and cancel that contract because the other one was better. And, I had to explain to him, that's not really, you're going to be hurting when.
and a great way to overcome that, Joyce, because I've heard of that as well, is earlier in our series we talked about the net to seller sheet,
Mhm.
which is a great tool if you're in a multiple offer situation. If you sit down with your seller and you say, this is how much commission you're going to have to pay to the co-op agent, plus the earnest money, does this second offer look as good as the first one does? That helps too.
Yeah.
That sets expectations right then and there, because they'll think they're getting an extra, and maybe sometimes it is only a few, $10,000 or $15,000 extra. They seem like it's, $1 million extra, when they realize that by their actions they could be responsible for taking a loss on it simply because they have to pay the other agent's commission.
Right. Yeah.
So interesting dynamic. The second type of contract termination is called the mutual termination. And I want to pull this up. Can you guys see mutual agreement to terminate?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. This is a great one. This is when everybody's happy, or you're going to rewrite the contract, or something's going on. But basically, this eliminates the buyer or the seller, getting mad and attempting to sue each other. It also eliminates any further obligation between the buyer and seller, and the real estate brokerages firms, other than to claim a commission. So, and again, I won't read the entire paragraph, but I paraphrased it. But when you drop down here, the thing that I like about this form, and I think it should be on all of them, is this side right here, buyer's broker and seller's broker. All parties are agreeing to mutually terminate the agreement, but it still has an area where you can recoup funds, be it, like Knuth said, like, inspection or loan application, or even, buyer or seller's, broker's expenses. It could be anything that you wanted to recoup. And disbursement of the earnest money. Just the parties direct the earnest money being held by holder to be dispersed as follows. And you have the room there to say, half goes to the buyer, half goes to the seller, or all to the buyer, all to the seller. This is the happy termination form, is what I like to call it, because everybody's happy. And further, it goes on to say, by signing this mutual termination, buyer and seller acknowledge they've each read and understood this mutual agreement and agree to its terms, which it's not on the other one. I don't understand. But simply putting this little box, these two boxes on that other form, I think would clear up, or even move forward, a lot of unilateral notices to terminate. It kind of just puts it out there. And you don't see these a lot. I mean, we see them occasionally, but the majority that we see come through that do cancel are the unilateral notice to cancel. So, anybody's experience with this one?
Mm-mm.
Never use this.
Okay, well, this is called the happy one. So if all parties are happy and they're gonna terminate and everybody's da-da-da, even the brokers get paid, this is the happy termination. And it's the
Yeah.
mutual agreement.
The other one doesn't have a place for the agents to sign, does it?
No, it doesn't. Let's flip back over
And
here.
I wonder why that is.
I don't know. That's what I'm saying. That's why the other one. Can you see the unilateral notice to terminate
Yeah.
now? I pulled it back up. Yeah, it's just, oh, wait. That's the broker engagement. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. That's the wrong one. Sorry. Here, unilateral notice to terminate. See, they could split this right here and put that box right there, broker and seller compensation, you know, or what the seller owes the buyer. But no, Joyce, you're correct. It's just the buyer and seller. And only on the proposed disbursement do both of them have to sign. So I don't know. It's kind of a mystery to me as well on that one. But the happy one is the happy one. So again, you know, that's my 2 cents worth on that with regard to being able to recoup. And I want to, whether I get on the forms committee or not, I kind of want to ask Seth Weissman about that the next time I see him. Because I think it would be something that would clear up a lot of issues that agents have trying to collect additional fees or funds from these terminations. So, all right, so those are the 2 forms that actually terminate an agreement. The next form that I wanted to talk about, a lot of agents mistakenly believe that if you take it out of the MLS, the agreement is canceled. Well, your agency agreement is not canceled unless you physically cancel it or it expires. So let's talk about a unilateral. Okay, in my opinion, this is the form when typically the seller, well, sometimes the buyer, but typically the seller is mad at their broker. And this is called the mad one. But it gives them termination by client. They are ending the agency. They do not want to work with you anymore. So what are your rights if they're ending the agency? Do you still have the holdover in the agreement, you know, for 90 days from termination? Yes, you absolutely do. You're protected on anybody that's seeing the property regardless. What about your fees? Yes, you're protected in the contract for your fees, even if they terminate. And it goes on to say unilateral termination of this agreement by client does not eliminate the client's legal obligation to broker for commission and or fees due to broker as specified in the brokerage engagement agreement, which would be photographs. You know, some agents spend a ton of money on photographs, and very few of them ever recoup that money if the seller pulls the listing or, you know, cancels the agreement. And it goes further on to say if the brokerage engagement agreement is a listing agreement, the cost to remove early the listing from any multiple listing service in which the property is listed shall be paid by client. Okay, there again, that's the $25 for FMLS and $25 for GAMLS for an early withdrawal of a listing. So the verbiage is in there. But going back to our dilemma on the other forms, how do we enforce this? You know, we could be dramatic and lock them in a root cellar until they agree to pay us, but that's not going to work. You know, I mean, what would you have? What resources would you have to fall back upon if you wanted to collect, say, $300 in photography, $50 to withdraw it from the MLS? How do you enforce that?
Can you put a lien on the house?
You know, Joyce, you might be very well able to put a mechanics lien on the house.
Yeah.
There's no reason why you shouldn't, because it's a trade and the trade wasn't paid,
Mhm.
you know, so that's a good one. I like that one. I'm not advocating it particularly, but I do like it.
I think the only way, I think the only way to be compensated would be to collect a retainer or sign an agreement up front of your expenses going into it. I'm not aware of any other way that you can do it unless you bring a case against it.
I agree with you. And let's just say it is $350. It's going to cost you $500 to file, probably,
Mhm.
or close to it. I mean, and you're already upside down and you haven't even gotten to court yet. So
Right.
it's tough. It's tough.
That's fine.
The bottom part, and again, these are two-part, either or, terminate by client, terminate by broker. Now, you know, when I get those calls from a client that's angry with their agent, and, you know, if it's in the middle of a transaction that has not terminated, I will never agree to do this. Okay. And this being a unilateral termination, the client's not necessarily going to know about this form unless somebody tells them, which, you know, can't really say that out loud either. But termination by broker, this is when it usually when it gets really, really bad, and we just want these people to go away if they are not under contract. And I've had agents in tears because they did not want to face their seller or their buyer because they were just mean and nasty to them. You know, overpriced the house, wouldn't agree to reduce it, wouldn't clean up around the house so they could show it, wouldn't let them in to show it. It's an impossible situation to be in.
Mhm.
You know, and I was further thinking about this along the way home, and it goes along the lines to what Alan said. You know, when you're in a listing agreement, maybe you should kind of cover how we would terminate this agency agreement if anything went wrong, and what you would agree to pay me, and set those expectations up front.
Mhm.
And or, like Alan said, collect those fees up front and then credit them back at closing. You know, you could always agree to do that if you chose to do so. Now, in this particular one on termination by broker, if the reason for the unilateral, this was interesting, I don't really get it, but if the reason for the unilateral termination of this agreement by broker is the breach of agreement by client. So what could a breach of agreement by a client be? What could it be?
Well, if they just didn't make the property available to you.
Good point. Unavailability to show the property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had one years ago where back then the seller had to provide a termite letter.
Mhm.
And he didn't want to have a termite inspection. And so he finally did agree to have a termite inspection, and they found termites in the form boards that were left under the house.
Wow.
And he asked me not to disclose that.
Wow.
And he basically, you know, was wanting to hide it. And I just said I couldn't do it. And he was just adamant about it. And I finally said, you know, I'm not going forward with this, hanging over this listing. You know, it just, he was just, there were other things too that I had already realized he wasn't on the up and up about, but that was the one that really
Yeah.
brought the camel's back.
Yeah. I've been in that situation myself. It wasn't necessarily about the termination. This was about a septic system issue that, you know, there was such poor drainage in the backyard that every time it rained, the septic tank flooded.
Mm-hmm.
And he literally had the audacity to tell me that I was never to show the property on a rainy day.
Wow.
And then it took a minute for the light bulb to go off over my head before I finally realized what was going on. And, I terminated the agency with them,
Yeah.
canceled the
Yeah.
agreement,
Same
Took-
kind of thing.
took my loss and paid my $50 and just ran in the opposite direction.
Mhm.
And then a Remax agent came along and listed and sold the property. And I had a, kind of a friendly relationship with her, not a close relationship, but I said, I asked him if he disclosed any septic problems on the seller's disclosure. And she said, well, once I finally got him to sign it, he did not disclose it. But, he said the weirdest thing to me was to never show the property in the rain, because he said he didn't want people tracking mud through the house. And it's kind of like, okay. I didn't have the heart to tell her, well, here's why, and this is what I found out.
And
I
that's
just
not what they'll be tracking through the house.
not at all. But yeah, so there's reasons that you would terminate an
Yeah.
agreement. But always remember, just if you have the listing, pulling it out of the MLS does not terminate it. All it does is take it out of the MLS. So these addendums need to be part of the agreement for the file to be compliant as well. So this is the unilateral. And then last but not least, the happy mutual termination. This one is not necessarily happy like the contract termination, but it is a mutual termination of brokerage engagement. It could be for any reason whatsoever. Maybe they were going to be transferred and they didn't get transferred. And, the broker doesn't have any investment in it, and or the listing agent just wants it to be, okay, we're just going to part ways here. This is the form that you would use to terminate mutually the brokerage engagement. And it goes on to further say you have the right to collect your multiple listing service fees, if any. And further, the reasons you could terminate would be simultaneously with the execution of this agreement, client shall pay broker blank to reimburse broker for fees, costs, expenses incurred by broker for connection with this agreement. And client shall pay broker, I can't talk, blank in full and final settlement of any and all claims, causes of action, suits, and damages of the broker arising out of or relating to this agreement. So if you select number 2, then you wouldn't be able to go back and try to claim a commission against them either. So not happy. I mean, nobody likes to terminate an agreement that you worked really hard for to get, so, but sometimes it happens. And then it goes on to hereby release one another from any and all claims, causes of action, and so on. And it's signed by the broker and the client, and any additional client signatures or any additional signatures that need to be added. So those are our 4 termination forms that the GAR uses, that are the GAR forms that we would typically use in our day-to-day practice of real estate out there. Any questions on anything that we've talked about so far, or just anything in general you'd like to ask about? Come on, there's a lot of you out there. I know somebody's got to say something. You're never this quiet. It's a standoff. Nobody's going to say anything. Okay. Well, folks, those are the 4 agreements that I wanted to go over today. And as I said in my email, along with the links to these videos, this will be posted this afternoon. That kind of wraps up this series. It's been a little clunky. I would have liked for some things to have gone smoother. It's mostly user error on my part, but hey, by the end, I was just handling this thing like a champ. So what I want to do, like we talked about, I think last week I'd mentioned it. We're going to come back in a couple of weeks and we're going to focus on the different contracts that are out there, land contracts, purchase and sales, lease purchase, commercial contracts, and go through those again, because I think one of our most popular sessions was the contract class. So I kind of want to revisit that. Most of these forms are pretty much self-explanatory. You just got to read them. And we'll just kind of focus on those, because I think that is kind of what would make a big difference in everyone's knowledge of this stuff. So I want to say thanks to everyone that rode this thing through the whole session. I greatly appreciate it. And we'll get back together in a few weeks. Thanks so much,
Okay.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Renee.
Thank you,
Renee.
Thank
Renee.
you. Have a
Thank
nice
you.
day. Have a great day.
You too.
You too. You too.